What if you need to validate against some set of complex rules? For example, zip code. In the United States, a zip code is our postal code, and it can be either 5 digits or 5 digits, a hyphen, and then 4 more digits. And if I remember correctly, there's actually an extended zip code that's more digits, but for now, that's all I'm going to worry about. You could write code that would perform a character-by-character validation and use a custom validator. Or you could use regular expressions. The regular expression validator control handles this for you. You set the validation expression property to be some regular expression, and we'll look at some simple examples, and it does the work of comparing the text you enter to that regular expression for you. Regular expressions are a well-defined, well-documented language for describing groups of characters. For example, the simplest regular expression. This says, for a state, I want 2 matches. That is, the first has to be an uppercase letter between A and Z, and the second has to be an uppercase letter between A and Z. It doesn't verify that the state is a valid state. All it verifies is that you've entered any 2 uppercase characters. For zip codes, you might see an expression like this. /D indicates we want a digit, and the 5 in curly braces means we want 5 of them. Now we have an optional group. I can tell that because it is in parentheses. That means it's a group, and the question mark means it might be there, it might not be there. If it is there, it has to consist of a hyphen followed by 4 digits. You can tell that because it's the same pattern you've already seen. /D means a digit, and 4 in curly braces means 4 of them. Because it's in parentheses, it's a single group, and the question mark indicates that it's optional. That allows 5 digits, and optionally a hyphen and 4 digits. We've examined this. I like to say that regular expressions are a write-only language. It's pretty easy to write them if you just study the steps and see what all the tokens mean. However, they're very difficult to read. It took me a few seconds to even think about what that expression meant when I hadn't seen it for a while. Now, it is a lot of effort to make these up. There is a regular expression editor in Visual Studio that makes it easier. It provides a limited list of values, but there are a large number of resources available on regular expression. There are books on the subject, and one of my favorite sites is www.regexlib.com, which is a community-supported library of useful regular expressions. There are tools that help you create regular expressions if you need something that isn't available on that site. So you'll need to investigate regular expressions if you want to make these part of your toolkit for working in ASP.NET. But let's look at an example that uses regular expressions to validate data on our sample page. A number of the fields on our sample form include regular expression validators. For example, state has one here that verifies that you get a reasonable state value. It's not really complete because, as you saw previously, it's only checking to ensure that you enter 2 uppercase letters. Probably not a great way to ensure that you got a valid state. In a real application, you'd have a drop-down list of states, right? Okay. For postal code, here we have a regular expression validator, which uses the expression you already saw to validate that that's a valid postal code in the United States. Now at this point, I'm going to bring up the regular expression editor, and you can see that I've chosen US zip code. But for some other fields, I might require some other kind of regular expression. Here is a US phone number that has a number of optional parts. You can look at this and see here's an optional thing with 3 digits, or an optional thing with 3 digits followed by a hyphen, then 3 digits followed by 4 digits. So this accepts an area code followed by a hyphen, or an area code followed by a space, and then the required 3-4 for a US phone number. This list is very short. If you need to enter a French phone number, it's here, or a German phone number, it's there. Obviously, the US is the simplest phone numbers out there. Lots of different variations in Germany. Actually, in some countries, I just realized this recently, There is no specific format on phone numbers. They can be any number of digits. Has to be some minimal number like 7, but from there it could be 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, who knows how many digits. At least in the US, we're pretty much guaranteed that it's either 7, 10, or 11. You might have to put the 1 in front for every phone number. In any case, this list is somewhat limited, and if you can't find what you need there, you'll need to go online or start creating your own validation expression. Now, there's no reason you have to enter one of these items on this list. You can definitely make up your own. That editor is only there to help you create a validation expression. We also have a regular expression validator on the phone number here. And again, that uses the US phone number that you saw in the regular expression editor. Well, let's check and see if this works. I'll view the page in a browser. And let's enter the required values. And let's enter an invalid phone number. Well, clearly that didn't match. Let's try one that might match. That works fine. Now let's enter an area code. A space afterwards doesn't seem to work. I was wrong. A hyphen should work, though. There we go. So it accepts a hyphen. How about nothing at all? Nope, didn't like that too much either. Seems to want a hyphen, or I bet it will accept an area code in parentheses like that. Yep, it bought that altogether. So we have to specify something that it can match against before it'll validate this page. How about postal code? Clearly that won't work. This works, and that works, but of course this will not. So that seems to be working. And for state, if we enter lowercase letters, that's no good. If we enter uppercase letters, any two uppercase letters, even though they don't represent a state, will be accepted by the regular expression validator. You can use the regular expression validator in combination with other validators as well. So I could have, for example, on first name, a required field validator that requires that I enter something, and a regular expression validator to ensure that what I entered begins with an uppercase letter, for example. So there's ways you can combine these two or multiple validation controls together. What if you need validation that's not supplied by any other control? Well, you can create your own validation using the custom validator control. This control allows you to supply server-side validation, and optionally, you can supply client-side validation as well. You have to supply server-side. You don't have to supply client-side validation. Now, it's up to you to determine whether the value is valid and to set the isValid property appropriately. The custom validator control raises the server validate event, and this allows you to validate on the server. Since it's an event, the code you run happens on the server. That's the only place it could happen. You'll want to set the isValid property of the control, and this indicates to the page whether the whole page is valid or not. It can't be valid unless your control is valid. On our sample page, we have a custom validator for the birth date field. It's valid only if the birth date is more than 18 years before the current date. There really is no simple way to have this happen without creating some sort of custom validator, and it requires code to perform the calculation. Now, if you're going to work with the custom validator, you'll need to set the client validation function if you intend to use client-side validation. This indicates the function to be run on the client side, and it performs the client-side validation. So in this property, you'll enter the name of the JavaScript function that you'll be running on the client side. In the server validate event, you get handed the server validate event args object. That's that E second parameter. And you'll use the value and isValid properties. They hand you the value, and you'll set the isValid property. In this procedure, you write code to validate the data, that is the value property, and you'll set the isValid property. That's the value you'll need to set to indicate whether you succeeded or not. Now, when does it do the validation? Well, remember, this thing doesn't get pushed back to the server until all the client-side validation has been completed. So if any of the controls on the page fail validation because of client-side code, well, you'll never get called. If you have other client-side validation, you want to add client-side validation for the custom validator as well. Otherwise, your server-side validator code will never happen. So make sure that you do add client-side validation code, and that requires learning a little scripting to make it happen. If you validate on the client side, ASP.NET will call the procedure that you specified in the client validation function. The procedure has to be written in some scripting language. It could be VBScript, but don't, or JavaScript. It has to accept two parameters, just like the server-side validation function. The first is the object that raised the event, and the second is the object that contains the isValid and value properties. You'll place your code inside the script tags in HTML view. And which scripting language should you use? Well, most likely JavaScript, because more browsers support it. Actually, only one browser supports VBScript, and so most developers really don't write client-side validation code using VBScript because it limits you to Internet Explorer. Let's look at an example of validating the birth date using a custom validator control. If we look at the birth date control, it has a validator here, which is the required field, and it also has a custom validator down here. Let's look at the properties of the custom validator. Well, I have an error message property set, and I have a text property set there. Employees must be 18 years old. Remember, the text property is the one that appears within the validator control. We also have set the client validation function, which is client check birth date. We'll look at that in a minute. And the control to validate, which is txt birth date. I changed that by accident. Those are the only properties we have to set. So let's look at the client-side code for this page. Look here at the code. We should find down here our function client check birth date. It has two parameters, just like any event handler on the server would have. And it's inside a script tag where we have a type attribute that indicates that what we have is JavaScript code. Okay, well, what's in this JavaScript procedure? What we have is a try-catch block that attempts to parse the value coming to us in this args parameter. That's the value. We attempt to parse it as a date and make a new date that corresponds to that. So that's our birthday date. And so the code then just checks to make sure that the getFullYear method call on that date plus 18 is less than or equal to the current date. If it isn't, then we have a problem. We'll set isValid equal to whether that expression returns true. Now, of course, this conversion might have failed. And in that case, we get an exception, and in our catch block, we just set the args.isValid to false. So if we pass in a value that isn't a date at all, we immediately fail our client-side validation. So that's the client-side script for this procedure. What does the server-side script look like? If we look at the code for this page, we'll see within here the server validate procedure. This receives the same two parameters as we saw on the client-side script, and here we have pretty much the same code. We attempt to parse what the user enters as a date and place it into the birth date variable. If it doesn't parse, we get an exception and we don't validate. If it does parse, we verify that if we add 18 years to the date, we get a date that's less than or equal to today's date. Well, let's verify that this works. I'm pretty sure that it does, but I'll view this in a browser. Enter things in the required fields. Now, of course, the birth date is a required field, so we can't submit without putting something in there. But if we enter something that isn't valid, you can see that the client-side scripting caught the fact that we entered something that couldn't be parsed as a date. If we enter something like, again, the client-side script sees that it is a valid date, but it doesn't get validated because it's not 18 years in the past. If we enter something like 1989, now we validate correctly. The only way we could show the server-side validation would be to remove the client-side code. We could do that, but I'm sure you'll believe that if we remove the client-side code, we wouldn't get any client-side validation, and we'd only see the validation occur after we attempted to submit this page. And actually, we'd only see it if we succeeded in submitting the page. That means all the client-side scripting succeeded, and we got to the server, and the server-side validation took over and verified that this was not a valid date. You'll often want to summarize the results of validating the controls on your form, and you've seen this already on our sample page. The validation summary control gathers the results of the isValid properties of all the controls on the page, and then displays the error message properties of all of them that have isValid equals to false. So for any control on the page whose isValid property isn't true, you'll see the error message property from that validation control in the validation summary control. The validation summary control has 3 different display modes. You can choose from list, you see a list of errors, a bullet list, so you see the list with bullets in front of them, and a paragraph, which just displays a paragraph. The sample page tries them all. You can also turn the show message box property to true. Now, this only works if the browser supports it. Internet Explorer does. And the sample uses this to display a message box which has all the errors in it. You've seen this on the sample page. It's an alert that pops up in a modal fashion above the browser window. Let's review how the validation summary control looks on the page. Here on our sample page, we actually have multiple instances of the validation summary control. Here's one that displays its errors as a bullet list. Here's one that displays it as a paragraph, and here's one that displays it as a list. If we look at the properties of this, Validation Summary 3 also has its Show Message Box property set to true. Bad enough to have one of them set this to true. Certainly we wouldn't want to set more than one of them to true, because then we'd get multiple message boxes. Let's run the page again and review what all of the validation summary controls look like on the page. If I submit at this point, we have 4 things that are wrong. This is what the message box looks like, at least using the theme that I'm currently using. Yours will look slightly different, of course. I'll click OK. And down here, we see the 3 different layouts. The bullet list has bullets, the single paragraph has a single paragraph, and the list just displays the list of error messages. These are all coming from the error message property of each individual validation control. So you need to set that property in order for the validation summary control to work at all. Beyond that, you just choose the mode that works best for you: bullet list, single paragraph, or list mode. And you decide whether or not to display the message box that can be displayed in some browsers. Certainly in Internet Explorer, it works fine. Now, if you think about it, there's a situation that might come up that could cause your validation trouble. You might have pages that include multiple groups of controls, and perhaps each group on the page needs separate validation. The problem was, before this functionality was available, that is, validation groups, every page validated as a whole. So it wasn't possible to have 2 different groups, each of which would validate separately on the page. You had to do some weird workarounds to get around it. In ASP.NET 1.0 or 1.1, this required writing code. Starting at ASP.NET 2.0, validation groups make this feature easy. All you have to do is set the validation group property for each validation control within a logical grouping. And you set the validation group property for the control that triggers the postback. This means that the page can post even if only a portion of the controls on the page validate correctly. Let's look at our example that demonstrates this behavior. Within the project, I have two identical pages except for one tiny setting difference. We have no validation groups and validation groups. Let's look at no validation groups. This page has two clumps of information, one clump for home information and another for work information. They each have their own submit button, but the submit button attempts to obviously post the page back. And we have a bunch of required field validators and other validators on here. Now really, a user only is going to click one of these submit buttons. Let's try it. I'll show this in a browser. If I enter home information, and click submit, this should be valid. But it can't be because all those other fields haven't been supplied. Well, really, this is a bad situation because what I filled in is valid for the page. I have all the information I need. So we need some way to split them out into groups so that I can click submit on home information and it won't even look at work information. Or I can submit work information and it won't even look at home information and try to validate it. Obviously, that's where validation groups come in. Let me close this down. Look at this one in the designer. In this case, for each of these properties, I've set the validation group property, on these controls, there we go. I've set the validation group property to be something meaningful. Home, 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 and on this button, which performs the submit, I've set the validation group property to be home. Then for all of these validation controls, I've set the validation group to be work, and down here for its button that could cause the submit back to the server, I've set its validation group to be work. The name you choose is your business. Any string will do. You just need to make sure you're consistent among all the controls in that group. They don't have to be within a proximity of each other. They don't have to be near or grouped or anything. As a matter of fact, I never mentioned, this is important, validation controls don't need to be sitting next to the control they're validating. There's no proximity requirement. I just wanted to mention that in case I made it look like they needed to be sitting right next to the thing they're validating. Same thing goes with validation groups. They can be scattered throughout the page. There's no rule on proximity here. Let's view this page in a browser and see the difference in the behavior. Of course, if I attempt to submit now, it can't submit. That's not right. But if I enter something and attempt to submit, it submits just fine. And everything's just great. Now, of course, I have code in that page that takes me to this page once I submit. Let's try it now, filling in just the work information. I won't touch home, but I'll fill in work instead. Click submit. Submits just fine. So there is no problem submitting just partial information as long as you ensure that the object that performs the submit, whatever control it is, has its validation group set to be the same name as all the controls you would need to validate in order to perform that submit. This makes it possible to work with groups of data on a single page. This wasn't possible until we had validation groups.